Right, this is the first episode of Skeleton Songs. I suppose we should introduce ourselves.
You're Lottie Bevan.
And you're Alexis Kennedy.
Correct so far.
So we are a small indie game development team.
Microscopic indie game development
Yes,
team.
we are two people in our own flat with our cats, occasionally wearing clothes.
Yeah.
And we
It's not going to be that sort of podcast.
And we make narrative games, which is why we thought we should start a podcast about stories and narratives across both games and literature, because you, Alexis, are Mr. Games and Mr. Literature, but I have no claim to the former and can only claim I'm an English graduate, so therefore can talk.
And you've been making games for quite some time.
I have been making games, that's true.
But basically, if I understand correctly, the idea is that we spend most of our life snorkeling up nonsense. And it comes out in the games. And if we
tasty nonce.
If we de-snorkel it in the podcast as well, there'll be less nonsense in the games and more nonsense in the ears of the people now listening.
I mean, yes, so it's not a method to help us be better. It should be interesting for people listening.
Yes, what you say.
But yeah, so we thought we'd start our first episode about les Vampyres, the creepiest of all peers. They are currently in the cultural consciousness because of the BBC version of Dracula, which I have not yet watched, partly because I'm a snob, but also because apparently it's quite scary. So we thought we'd talk about them.
What do you think about vampires?
I love them, as everyone does, but I will be honest, there's been a lot of them.
So you are you're approaching my position, I think. I'm sick of the fuckers, but also I really like them.
We can't swear.
I know. Can we not?
I don't know. I mean,
well,
Apple
let's
won't
try
like
it and see if Apple notice.
Okay.
They've probably got some sort of swear-all recognition. But I was I think I was sick of vampires while it was still cool to be sick of vampires, because I'm really old, not like vampire old, but the Anne Rice Tom Cruise film came out and Buffy was a thing and suddenly vampires were everywhere.
Yeah.
And everyone among my friends seemed to be saying, "Do you know vampires are actually about sex?" And I was, "Oh, really? Okay, I'd like to listen to that talk another time." So I've long been a bit grumpy about them, which is why usually when I put them in my games, I don't make them sexy. It's a sort of...
It is lazy, I think.
To make them sexy?
Yeah.
Because they're evil and they bite you, so they're sexy. And
they come in the night and a lot of people kind of leave it there. They don't add anything else on. They don't say why they're sexy. And if I went on a date and I came back and told my friends that I'd had a date with a sexy person, they said, "Why are they sexy?" And I said, "Because he was pale and he appeared in the night." They'd be like, "I'm not sure that's very sexy. You can't just intrinsically be sexy by doing that."
But that said, the thing is they have always been kind of about sex.
As we will get on to.
So what I can't remember if you talked about this, because this is unrehearsed, people. But
I've never worked with this animal before.
you can go back a long way and you find things that are sort of what end up being vampires. So the first instance that I know about, and they may well be other instances that better informed people know more about, there's a creature in Sumerian, so we're talking like 4,000 years, 6,000 years ago, called a Lilu, and the Lilu was the father of Gilgamesh, or it was one of an order of beings called the Lilu, and it's some sort of night spirit that goes wandering about. I don't think actually biting people, but making a nuisance of itself. And Lilu became Lilitu, which was a female version, and obviously, as you know in mythology, women are usually more upsetting than men.
We're the bad guys, yeah.
By the time it becomes a Lilitu, it's stealing babies, and it's having sex with men while they're asleep.
Mythical ladies.
And it's spreading disease. And there's an Assyrian thing called Lilitu. I think it's actually a storm demon, and that's got like owl's talons, and I think it does actually bite people, carries disease.
It sounds amazing. And this is 4,000, 6,000 years old.
Well, but Assyrians, I think, are more like, 2,000, 1,500 BC, so they're a bit more recent. But the point is, it's a Middle Eastern Fertile Crescent myth with this idea of a thing that goes around in the night making use of itself and very quickly becomes associated with sex and sex as products. Now, as you probably know, sex often causes children. And so a lot of vampires end up either stealing babies or biting babies, or being created when you... if somebody dies while they're in childbirth or while they're pregnant. I think Malaysian folklore has a kind of vampire, I think a langsua, I can't remember which one is which comes to be if a woman dies while giving birth, and another kind which dies if it comes, which comes to live if a woman dies while pregnant.
Right.
And obviously, if you die while pregnant, then become a vampire. If you die while you're giving birth and become a vampire, you probably want to bite babies because that makes you a good villain. Yeah. But here's my etymology fact. There are obviously...
We should point out to listeners that you are in fact a linguist, so etymology
long
is
ago.
Your total jam.
So there's obviously lots of great words for vampires. We're going to get into, I think, the most famous word for vampires, apart from vampires in a minute and being rude about it. But empousai and soucouyants and aluka and vricolax and
delicious words.
They all are, and a lot of them, especially to English speakers, sound great. But
do you think in their original language they're like?
Well, that's the thing. I told you my Croatian ex-wife, I wanted to call our kid if we had a boy Zvonimir because it sounded amazing to English speakers.
That's a beautiful name.
Well, she said no. In Croatian, it's like calling somebody Zvonimir is like being called Kevin or something. It's really sort of she said it was old man's name, so it's like being called Edward.
It's not an old man's name.
I don't know. Anyway. So, etymology. Lilitu, or lilu, appears to come from a root that means something like night-crying bird or screech owl. Mm-hmm. And there's another much more famous word for vampires. They're called strigoi. I think it's a Romanian word. I think it shows up in Albania as well. And obviously anybody who's been watching vampires on TV in the last 5 years will know it's the word that's used to identify the vampires in Guillermo del Toro's The Strain. Mm. So, wonderful guttural word. Strigoi, there's a bunch of similar words like strigays and strix that often are used to mean sorcerers as well as vampires. There's a lot of confusion about what's a sorcerer, what's a vampire, what's a witch in the folklore. But it's from originally the Latin term strix, which means screech owl. So from the beginning, we've got these flying, shrieky things.
That's really interesting, actually.
There you go, etymology. That's what the truth is like.
So you're going to talk to me about empousai?
Yeah.
What's the difference between empousai, Alexis, and soucouyants?
Right, so as I mentioned earlier, I'm sort of mean about vampires. So when I decided we were having vampires in Cultist Simulator, I wanted to make them...
Which is, in case you haven't heard of it, the game that we've made most recently.
Yeah, you should play it.
Buy it.
We buy it, then play it. I wanted to put vampires in because they're fundamentally an interesting myth, because they have something to do with sex, inevitably, annoyingly, because they have an impression of age and power that sort of comes with the territory. Because the whole idea of sucking somebody's blood or other essences. There's a Malay vampire. It's not the langsua, it's the other one. But it's got long hair and it sucks blood through a hole in the back of its neck. Pontianak, yes, there we go. So... Yeah, so a lot of them suck blood, some of them suck other things. Soucouyants suck blood through the soft places of the body and leave like black marks. But I wanted words that expressed
soft places in the body.
Particularly unusual words that people might have come across that sounded like they were from 2 or 3 different languages. So Alukites, that's from Aluka, which is a Hebrew word which I believe means horse leech originally,
right,
but refers to vampires in Jewish mythology. Empousai is a Greek word that means a sort of night prowling thing that makes a nuisance of itself. Soucouyants are vampiric creatures in Caribbean, I think particularly Trinidadian folklore, that shed their skins. And I wanted, without too many spoilers about what happens in the game, a bunch of terms for a general type of shape-shifting, skin-shedding, night-flying, vital essence devouring, ancient, powerful, usually but not always a lady. And there's a particular reason they're usually but not always ladies.
And it's not just because they were written by man and it was sexy.
Definitely. No, and in fact, empousai, aka Alakites, aka soucouyants in Cultist Simulator are very rarely sexy, but there is a particular set of circumstances that leads to them coming to be, and that's a set of circumstances that is more likely to involve, on average, a woman than a man. But you do get male soucouyants as well, they're just a bit of a rarity. Anyway, so soucouyants are these very folkloric Caribbean things that suck blood out of your soft places while you're sleeping. I think they suck your breath as well. They shed their skins, they fly, they look like old women. That's the thing about mythological female menaces, right? They're either really hot
or ancient hags.
Those
are the two types of women.
Because we know middle-aged women don't exist in folklore. And Alucard, I don't know much about, but just this, a lot of Hebrew words imported into English sound great. They have this sort of occult quality to them, and they're often quite guttural. They sound half familiar to people from a Judeo-Christian background very often, so that's really useful. And in empousai, I was just very taken by some of the ridiculous details in the empousai myth that didn't make it into Cultist Simulator. So, for example, you know what empousai's legs are made of?
No.
Bronze or brass, but they've only got one of the legs.
They're a peg-legged lady.
Yeah, they're a sort of thing that hops around on like a boing, boing, and then they bite people or other ways of making use of it. But sometimes they have two legs.
Two bronze legs?
No, one leg is made of bronze.
Right.
And the other leg is made of cow dung.
I'm sorry. Who wrote this myth?
The Greeks. I think the cow dung thing particularly
after an excellent party.
I can't remember which playwright, but somebody claims to be attacked by an empousai in one of the one of the Greek comedies, and he tells his master all these ridiculous stories about it, including that its left leg was brass and its right leg was cow dung. But I didn't think those would really add verisimilitude.
Well,
but they fly. That's the other thing about vampires. Keep noticing is Lilith's the Screech Owl, Strigoi are from Screech. Lots of the Malaysian things fly about the whole time, and this thing that they're present in the air, and often that they're some sort of lighter form of flesh seems a constant. This thing of turning into bats feels like a modern invention, but it's not actually that modern. It's
I think the thing about them eating babies is really interesting, because I think it sounds like the very, very oldest form of vampires that we would now kind of link to vampires, like your empousai and your soucouyants, sound like they were essentially developed to be bad things, and they reflected magically bad things that happened in reality. So obviously one of the worst things that could happen to somebody 6,000 years ago is their baby dies. That's just, roundly rubbish for lots of reasons. So you invent a creature that is responsible for it, and that creature makes sense to come from a mother who herself has maybe lost a child or died in childbirth or whatever it is. But in the Western tradition of vampires that I think people are more familiar with, there's no specific affiliation with killing or eating babies. There's definitely a sense of upsetting the natural order of things. I think you mentioned the infamous Into the Vampire and Anne Rice earlier, and of course that famous film features, I think, a very young Kirsten Dunst as a 12-year-old vampire.
Oh God, it is her, isn't it?
Yeah, very, very small Kirsten. And, that's meant to be creepy, because here's this, angelic-looking little Kirsten Dunst, and actually she is deliberately luring older men in a slightly sort of paedophilic way to their deaths, and then it's very frightening. And of course she has superhuman strength, so she looks very innocent, but is in fact extremely powerful. But we don't get the same sense that they are fundamentally responsible for murdering children. The Western tradition, I think, leans much more heavily into the kind of fun, sexy bit of it. And what I want to talk about from today is something that actually predates the infamous Dracula by 26 years. Is by an author who I have a total soft spot for, because he's not very good. I wouldn't say he's the best writer, but he really commits, and I respect that. So this story...
Before you start on the story, can I get in one last etymological note?
Always with the etymologies.
So, the word that people are most likely to think of after vampire in European folklore is, of course, Nosferatu. And the thing about Nosferatu is it sounds, as an English speaker, basically Eastern European. But if you speak a Slavic language, or one of the weird Eastern European languages that aren't Slavic, like Hungarian, you may well be furrowing your brow and thinking, this doesn't actually sound that familiar except via vampire mythology. And it seems that Bram Stoker found it in
the fraud.
Well, he was frauded by a fraud, by the sound of it. There's a lady who wrote a bunch of quite compelling accounts of folklore in Romania, in the area which was then still mostly called Transylvania, and she was misinformed or misspelt something by the looks of it. There are some dubious etymologies for Nosferatu, but it looks like her book was the first time it appeared. But the reason I thought of it is because you talked about the destruction of the natural order, and notably she talked about two kinds of vampires, two kinds of Nosferatis, haunting Romania, and the living ones and the dead ones. So the dead ones, you put in your grave and you won't stay there, but the living ones, if you are the child of two parents who are themselves illegitimate,
right,
then you might turn into a vampire while you're still alive, and certainly you will after you're dead. So you have to put the vampire in the grave, and you have to walk around it every year on the anniversary of its death, smoke your cigarette. As long as you do that, it won't make a nuisance of itself.
Wait, I'm sorry, so just not being married is enough?
Being the child of two people, neither of whom with children married parents. So you're like a grandson of illegitimate conception.
I see, so you're like illegitimacy squared.
Yeah, well, you can't mess about. You should get married before you start generating
this
children.
This podcast
just
is sponsored by the Vatican. We hope you enjoyed its wholesome message. That's bizarre.
Folklore.
But yeah, the story that I was going to talk about is by a chap called Sheridan Le Fanu. He's actually called Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. He just wanted lots of names. And he wrote an 1872 novella called Carmilla, which, like I said, predates Dracula. A lot of people haven't heard of it. And like I said, he's not the best writer, but I would maintain that Stoker is not the best writer either. His book just captured the attention of the public in a way that Le Fanu didn't manage to. But this is a novella that was initially published as a serial in a London literary magazine called The Dark Blue. And it is pretty sexy. It's a classic case of... it reads very modernly, basically because the template we now have for the vampire that we all know and love, the Dracula, is essentially drawn not explicitly, but in large part from what Sheridan Le Fanu did in Carmilla. So it's as explicitly lesbian as you could have got in 1872, and bearing in mind it was written by a guy in a society that was not particularly forward-thinking in terms of gender equality, it's pretty voyeuristic and meant to be sexy because it's about two ladies theoretically having a kiss, which is terribly exciting. And it does a lot of the things that, again, you would expect from modern vampire fiction. So it's presented as a casebook, an extract from a casebook of a Dr. Hesselius, which sort of sounds a bit foreign and fun, and it's a sort of casebook, so someone else has written it, and you don't know who they are. He is, interestingly, considered the first occult detective in literature, which sounds like an amazing accolade for him. But the story follows a teenager called Laura, who lives in a secluded castle in Austria with her sad widower dad, who's rich because he lives in a castle but is sad. So they have a lovely childhood together. She is fairly lonely but fairly content because her dad is a nice dad. And she opens the book by telling us about her happy childhood, which is only marred by one event, which is an early dream she has when she's 6, where she sees a vision of a beautiful woman in her bedchamber, and later complains of pain in her breast where she has been punctured, but upon being examined, there is no such puncture wound upon her breast. So already we've got a kind of weird vibe going on here.
And she's 6?
She is 6 at the time, yes.
Right, it's the baby stealing again, isn't it?
Well, I was going to say, we're already establishing that there is some sort of weird breast focus going on in the bedroom, but I think 6 is a bit young for even Sheridan Le Fanu to be implying it's sexy, but I think it's what us literary scholars would call foreshadowing.
Right.
So buckle on up, because we fast forward 12 years after this event to a time where a planned visit to the castle by one of her father's friends and his young niece is cancelled because of the niece's mysterious and unexplained death. And the friend of her father, this guy called General Spielsdorf, sends this enigmatic letter to her father saying, I'm sorry we can't come, my niece is unfortunately dead, which was unexpected, and I will tell you the horrible details of what happened when I see you, but I'm not going to put it in the letter. So there's this strange...
As you do.
There's this strange cancellation. And it makes Laura realise that she's actually very lonely, even though she's content in her isolated, spooky Gothic castle. But just as she realises she is lonely and she regrets not being able to meet this niece, called, by the way, Bertha, remember Bertha, there is a quite significant carriage accident just outside their castle, which brings a mysterious girl of Laura's age called Carmilla into her life, along with Carmilla's mysterious mother, who kind of just has a total fit and says that Carmilla definitely can't say anything about herself, and that she, the mother, is on very important business and is going to have to leave Carmilla with these kind random hosts for 3 months while she's away on business. But Carmilla isn't allowed to say anything about it. Which is taken very well by Laura and her father, particularly because Laura and Carmilla both recognise each other as the woman they saw in visions when they were 6. So it turned out that Carmilla also had a vision of a beautiful lady in her bedchamber at night. So I'm not going to tell you the whole of the plot because you should read the book, it's quite short. But we go through some romantic advances between Carmilla and Laura. There's nothing actually explicit, again, because it's 1872. But there's lots of intimations that Carmilla is interested in Laura beyond just a sort of innocent female friend, bearing in mind they're both 18 now, so urges are probably occurring. There are some typically vampiric behaviour that, remember, would not have been typical to the reader of the original story at the original time. So we know that, well, Laura notices that Carmilla will sleep in the day and she refuses to join in prayers, that she tends to sleepwalk at night, and women and girls in the towns around tend to start dying from mysterious diseases. There's a bunch of Gothic tropes, which is something we're going to come back to, I think, a lot in this podcast. So we get, of course, she's already in a spooky, isolated castle with no kind of clear mother figure. An heirloom painting is delivered to the castle for the Laura's family, which shows a centuries-old ancestor called Mercalla, notice the letters, which looks exactly like Carmilla. And there are some horror elements as well, like she has nightmares of being pounced on by a cat-like beast in the night. And she actually sees a vision at one point of Carmilla at the end of her bed in the middle of the night, drenched in blood. So like some pretty powerful imagery going on here. And it's written in a very fun, engaging way, even though it is slightly old prose now. And anyway, Laura's health gets worse, as you might expect. Doctors find small pinpricks that they can't explain in her neck. And eventually the narrative comes to a head when General Spielstoff appears again on the scene and finally tells Laura and her father that how Bertha died, which is essentially that she met a girl who looked exactly like Carmilla, who is called Milaka, and her strange mother. You see what I meant about
the Scrabble murders.
He doesn't try terribly hard, but it's great nonetheless. And the general tried to save Bertha when he realised that some horrible spirit was visiting her at night and making her ill. So he hid in the corner with a sword and tried to attack the thing when it came, but then he didn't manage it, and the person who returned to the form of Carmilla ran off into the night without being harmed, and unfortunately Bertha died. So Spielsdorf tells this to Laura and her dad, who are on their way, for reasons I won't bore you with, to somewhere else, and they end up going to find Mercalla's tomb. So remember, Mercalla is the ancient ancestor of the family who looks exactly like Carmilla. And of course they find it in a ruined chapel, and Carmilla follows them and appears in this chapel at the crisis of the story, and General Spielsdorf goes totally nuts when he sees her, because of course it looks exactly like the girl he saw murder Bertha, and Carmilla in turn goes totally nuts because she now realises that the jig is up. So they have a big old fight. The general attacks her with an axe. A descendant of a vampire vanquisher appears and
Has
says...
he been foreshadowed, or is he just like...
He does, I mean, he's been foreshadowed a bit, but kind of the paragraph or chapter before. It's
Right.
really not woven complexity here. And he says, definitely vampires. He finally confirms. Because remember, for a modern reader, we've seen all of these tropes before.
Yeah.
Right? We know the moment they say, oh, the beautiful lady who sleepwalks and is a bit lesbian, everyone's like, oh, classic vampire. But the 1872 reader of The Dark Blue would not necessarily have leapt to that conclusion. So you need some sort of vampire expert to come in and say, yeah, this is vampire, which he does. So they go and find Marcalla's hidden tomb, which is delightfully covered in blood and appears the corpse appears to still breathe. You can see its heart beating and its eyes are open. So they drive a stake through its heart, it shrieks, they decapitate it, and they burn the body and throw the ashes in the river. So it's actually very, very similar to what happens in Dracula the book. There's lots and lots of different versions of the story that have been retold in a variety of mediums, but the original book follows that in lots of ways, apart from it sort of takes out the lesbianism and puts in a bunch of stuff about stuff at home. But I think it's really interesting that it follows so closely, and there is something about Stoker's Dracula that really captured the Western attention, but something about Le Fanu's that just didn't. And there's lots of reasons for that, you know, context being probably one of the most significant ones. But that really is one of the first prototypes for the vampire. And if you think about it, it hasn't changed that much. I mean, we're talking about centuries ago now that he wrote this.
Well, it works, right, isn't it? I guess the story, you have a bit of dramatic irony where the audience knows more about what's going on than the characters. You have this slow decline, which can be paced to the author's preference. You know, you can take as long losing blood as you like. You can have advances and retreats, and then there is something about this image of opening a coffin and finding a corpse which is not a corpse, which really strikes. And I guess it's what you said coming in about vampires.
Obsession
disturbing,
with natural order. Yeah. You know, and I guess everything in the stereotype upsets it. You know, it shouldn't be a beautiful lady doing evil because apparently beautiful ladies are good. There's a strong history of basically saying the more pretty something is, the better it is morally. Vampires shouldn't be strong if they're skinny, attractive women. Vampires shouldn't be able to fly because they look like humans. Dead people should stay dead, except vampires don't. So I guess a lot of it is about things not going the way they should. But I also wonder if our kind of vampire ennui is because certainly the Western tradition hasn't really changed it up for 200, 300 years now, which is weird.
Well, I mean, there was a big change which occurred, I think, about the 80s. I remember...
the hair got big.
The hair got big, but so we had... I don't know when Anne Rice started writing. Obviously, she's the grandmother of all current sexy vampire literature.
I thought that was Tumblr.
But there was a film called The Lost Boys.
Yes, which you keep trying to make me watch, and I keep
because it might be good. But the first time I watched it as a teenager, I thought it was brilliant, and the second time I watched it as an adult, I thought it was not brilliant. So I think it's possible it's not brilliant. But
that's exactly what I've just said about Le Fanu, to be fair.
That's true, and that's the thing is vampires are like monosodium glutamate. You put them in a story and it becomes more palatable, even if it's still basically nonsense. But Lost Boys, I remember the poster, the tagline was "Sleep all day, party all night, never grow old, never die. It's great to be a vampire."
Oh, I see. It made it fun.
So, and that's the thing. Up until all three, you know, Carmilla is not somebody who has a particularly good time. Dracula, you know, he's living the life in his castle, but he's not a cheerful gent.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that actually, because I have facts to contradict you, which is I was looking into whether Carmilla was the first vampire novel of the Western tradition that we would now consider vampire literature, and it's not. It was predated by two other works which are considered the earliest forms of vampire literature, which again is way before Dracula. And the first one is an 1819 piece of work by a guy called Polidori called The Vampyre, which is inspired by the life of Lord Byron, which is hilarious. Lord Byron is the first vampire.
I remember now, the character's... It's actually Lord Ruthven, isn't it?
I've not read it, so I don't know, but that's not the bit.
The
bit is
the
second one. Is a story called... it's a penny dreadful written in 1847 called Varney the Vampire. And it's the first... I am not lying to you. Like, imagine the jingle, Varney the Vampire.
Yeah.
And it's considered the first example of what's called a sympathetic vampire, which Anne Rice then went on to popularise by having, you know, Brad Pitt look all mournful and say, "I'm so handsome and yet where is my soul?" And Varney the Vampire is apparently quite a sweet interpretation of, you know, a really evil creature from Satan, but you kind of like him and he's having kind of a fun time.
So I didn't know that. I heard the Polidori one, although I couldn't have told you much about it, but I didn't know about Varney at all. And it's not a great name, is it? But what I mean is that,
like Barney the dinosaur.
Up until sort of perhaps the 80s, there was this general expectation that vampires were gloomy men with widow's peaks or ladies with long flowing hair.
They were very serious.
Who pronounced things in operatic tones and were basically antagonists.
Yeah.
And post... Anne Rice, Joss Whedon, about a gazillion vampire diaries and True Bloods and all the rest of it, with this general idea that vampires are people who have some sort of psychic disease that makes them extra sexy and mean. And then, maybe sunlight kills them or not, maybe garlic kills them or not. But that's basically the thing, that they're not elemental forces that have to be dealt with by the characters. They are characters themselves.
Yes, that's a very good point. We're actually interested in their sort of psychological existence rather than just, there is a vampire in this room. Who is it? Right, well, on that bombshell, I think we've actually run out of time for our first episode about vampires. I think we've covered all of vampires. There's nothing left to say.
Help me, I'm crumbling to dust.
Yes, Alexis has unfortunately just stumbled into a pool of light. But thank you very much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed that. And we'll be back for our next episode with more Gothic stories and narratives and games.
And etymology.
You can't escape the etymology. So thank you very much for listening. And...
Are you going to say have a spooky day?
I did write that in the notes because
I think you should say have a spooky day.
Have a spooky day.